Okay, thank you to everybody for tuning in. We are continuing our shiur on the Siddur, on Tefillah. This is a class on Jewish liturgy. And we have so far covered through the Siddur the early parts of the Birchot HaShachar. We went through the Korbanot sections, and then we went through, before we introduced Hodu, or the Pesukei de Zimra, we decided to take a break and study the Kaddish, because customarily, although this is a very late custom and a very recent custom, customarily there is a Kaddish de Rabbanan recited after Rabbi Yishmael Omer. So we took a couple of shirim to speak about Kaddish. Now, while we're on the topic, I figured I didn't really want to leave the topic of Kaddish too quickly. We do have to get to Hodu and Pesukei de Zimra and a lot of that a lot of those tricky topics. However, I decided to linger and procrastinate and spend at least one more shiur, not on Kaddish, but on Amen. And I wanted to track the history of Amen with you tonight and discuss how the Amen response, how is it that the Amen response became a part of the Jewish liturgy? How old is it? How integral is it? And what can we know about it? And how much can we learn about it in one sitting and one night? So our journey into understanding Amen begins clearly in Tanakh. Because if we're going to understand the word, which is a word of Lashon HaKodesh, Tzvi just actually arrived. If we're going to understand the word Amen, which is from Lashon HaKodesh, we have to find the earliest places in Tanakh where the word Amen is used. And Amen today, when we think about the word, we think about it. I mean, there's an old English word for Amen, which is verily, which means yes, I believe. I believe, and this is true. It's like in Hebrew, the poskim say Amen means Amen ken yiratzon. So when we think about Amen today, it's almost like a halachic construct which follows a bracha, and we don't really think about Amen in many other ways. We don't often see the word Amen used in other contexts. But if we look in the Chumash, we're studying the word Amen. If you look in the Chumash, the first places that you see the word Amen is ironically not by brachot, but by klalot. We see the word Amen is not used to say yes to a blessing, but rather yes to a curse. And this is very similar in a way to when we were learning about the brachot, when we were learning about the blessings, we realized that the people in the Torah that say the blessings, they say Baruch Atah Hashem, or they say Baruch Hashem Elokei Sam Avraham. All of the people who use the word Baruch Hashem in the Chamishe Chumshei Torah are Goyim or Geirim. We find this unusual thing where the earlier usages of some of our more fundamental terms in Tefillah were not always originally natively Jewish, nor were they native to the liturgy. So just like we saw this by the words Baruch Hashem, by Amen, we also see a very interesting thing. We see that the first time Amen appears in the Torah is by a sotah. We see that we see that by a sotah, it says, Uba'u hamayim ha'me'arerim ha'ele b'meyayich latzbot ba'betin v'lanpil yarech ve'omra ha'isha amen amen. May this water that includes the spell enter your body, causing your belly to distend and the thigh to sag. And the woman shall say, Amen, Amen, which means affirmative, I understand. It's like a legalistic response. It's a terse response, affirmative, I understand. Or when we have in the end of Dvarim by the klalot of Har Grizim and Har Evel, over and over, the Torah says, Arur ha'ish, arur makleh, let's say, arur makleh aviv imo, cursed is he who hits his mother or his father, ve'amar kol ha'am, amen. The entire nation responds, amen, meaning that in the 5 books of Moshe, we do not find the word amen being used as in a positive sense. We don't see it being used to say, yes, I believe in this, or yes, this should be true, or yes, this should come to be. Rather, we see it in the essence of affirmative. Like, this is firm, this should be steadfast. Yes, I believe in this. Now, the soonest that we see the amen get to be used in a positive light is in the Nevi'im. So whether or not it's a little bit tricky to date this, but whether you date Tehillim earlier or Malachim earlier, one of the two of them is the first place to Melachim Aleph at least, it would be the first place to find the word amen used in a positive sense. Most famously, you'll find in Tehillim, Baruch Hashem, Elokei Yisrael, min ha'olam ve'ad olam, ve'amar kolam, amen hallelujah. This represents, the Tehillim represents a lot of the practice in the Beit HaMikdash. Or you'll have in Melachim, Vayan ben Ayahu ben Yehoyada et HaMelech v'yomar, amen, ken yomar Hashem Elokei Adoni HaMelech, right? Amen, so shall it be, and may the eternal, the God, Lord of the King, so ordained. So what's interesting about Tehillim more than Melachim is that Tehillim very often reflects the practices that the Leviim, the Levites, would practice in the Beit HaMikdash. Many of the songs in Tehillim were not authored by David himself. They were authored by other people like Asaph, or, for example, Moshe Rabbeinu. Famously, the Gemara says Moshe Rabbeinu authored a couple of the Bnei Korach, a couple of families authored different sections of Sefer Tehillim. And therefore, when we see certain Mizmorim in Sefer Tehillim with congregational responses, what these teach us is that these songs of these families of the Leviim were built in with responses. And in the Beit HaMikdash, when the Leviim would sing, they would call to the response of the congregation. They couldn't create a service or even the earliest skeletal forms of liturgy in the temple without involving the congregation around them. It simply doesn't work. You can't have one guy talking and everybody listening, or one guy praying and everybody listening. That's just not how constructive service works. It's not like people are going to maintain their attention to a service if there's only always one guy talking. So therefore, it became a natural part in the Beit HaMikdash for many different responses to be included. Some of the famous ones are Hoshana, right, or Hallelujah, or Amen, or Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto La'olam Va'ed, or Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo, or Baruch Hashem Baruch La'olam Va'ed. There were many praises that were used in the Beit HaMikdash that were a response to things that the Chazan would say, or the Shliach Tzibor would say, or the Kohen would say. And from these responses, or in tandem with these responses, we also have the earliest litanies, which are like early poetry. For example, the Hoshanot are one of the earliest forms of poetry because they are a litany. They're a simple poem where you have a statement, and then you have a Hoshana. Or like in Tehillim, you'll have a statement, and then Kilo Lam Chasto, Kilo Lam Chasto. You have the earliest forms of litanies were being constructed in the Beit HaMikdash and in the temple. And Amen is no different. Amen is one of those responses, which it would seem from Tehillim was used in the Beit HaMikdash, but not completely. And we're going to figure out why in a minute. First of all, before we do that, I want to take a left turn to a little bit of archaeology. There's an area, a coastal town in Eretz Yisrael called Yavnei Yam. It's on the coast in between Ashdod and Cholon. Over there, there's a couple of archaeological sites. Most notably here, as I'm showing you on the screen, is a fort on a hilltop in Yavnei Yam, which began its excavations by Jews in the 1960s. There was a professor named Yosef Naveh who was working for the Israeli Department of Archaeology, which eventually became part of Hebrew U. And he found there something called an astrakhan. An astrakhan is a clay cheres, like a shard of pottery, right? And in the olden days, nothing went to waste. So people would use shards of pottery or it's like a broken piece of paper. And they would scribble things on shards of pottery all the time. So he found a shard of pottery which had writing on it. What was exciting about this was that it was dated to roughly 650 BC, which is my math, almost 2,700 years ago in the reign of Melech Yoshia, right? So a very long time ago. And it's a clay cheres with writing on it in Paleo Hebrew. And the message on it is basically like a complaint from a worker to his governor. And he's complaining about the fact that one of the foremen who worked on the field that he worked on took his cloak. Like he works on the field that belongs to the governor. One of the guys in charge stole his cloak, and he's complaining to the governor, he stole my cloak. We're not sure exactly what actually went down. Maybe the guy took it as a collateral because he didn't pay. He's like, no, I worked. Essentially, we have a snippet of the conversation, and he's basically saying, and I'm showing on the screen like a translation here of the Paleo Hebrew. He's saying to him, that you could verify with my friends that I did. We worked all day. It was hot. I was there, and I should get paid. And if you ask my friends, he says haketzram iti becham hashemesh. I was there in the heat of the day. Achai ya'anuli amen. My brothers will say for me that this is true. Amen. That this is affirmative. And we can see that in the ancient Hebrew that was spoken by Jewish people, we see that they use the word amen not to mean like yes, amen ken yaratzon, yes, so shall it be, but they used it in common conversation to mean that the word affirmative, that my brethren will say yes, that this is true, this is the affirmative truth. So it was part of the actual language. So the reason this is important is because we find the Gemara and Ta'anit, and this actually comes, I believe, a little bit earlier also. I don't think it's just the Gemara and Ta'anit. It's based on the Mishnah and Sotah and the Mishnah and Ta'anit. But the Gemara says, B'med Dvarim Amurim, when do we say, there's just to give you a background, there's a special Shmona Esrei during a Ta'anit Tzibor, which has 24 brachot instead of 18. And the Gemara is in the middle of explaining how this Shmona Esrei works when you're doing it in a kahal, when you're doing it out in the street and you're doing a big rally and everybody's going to do Shmona Esrei, this special Shmona Esrei for the Ta'anit Tzibor together. How are the responses? And it says you do this bracha and they answer amen. You do this bracha and you answer amen. Finally, the Gemara interrupts and says, B'med Dvarim Amurim, when do we say that this procedure is as we just recited, bigvulim? That's only in the outlying areas, which means anywhere except the temple, anywhere except the Beit HaMikdash. Aval b'mikdash enoken. Nope, this is not how we do it in the Beit HaMikdash. Lefi she'en onin amen b'mikdash. We don't say the word amen in the Beit HaMikdash. And then it says, amen b'mikdash. I'm sorry, I didn't cut out the rest of this Gemara, but it brings a pasuk that says that they only, that we learn from that pasuk that we only give a tila, which has multiple tilot Hashem, not just one word. So they would say Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam V'ed. The response to a bracha, instead of amen, if they said Baruch Atah Hashem Goel Yisrael, they would reply Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam V'ed. Fascinating. Why? So why in the world? What were they so against? What were they so against doing amen in the Beit HaMikdash? We see that later. Even there's a Gemara in Sotah. I'm not sure if I cut it out. No, there's Gemara in Sotah which says that by Birkat Kohanim, in the Beit HaMikdash, they would say all three psukim, which are called the three brachot of the Birkat Kohanim. In the Beit HaMikdash, they would say them one after the other, and there would be no amen in between. Why? Because we don't say amen in the Beit HaMikdash. Why don't you say Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam V'ed? Well, it's too long. That's a hefsek. So the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash would say the whole Birkat Kohanim in one shot because they can't say amen and they don't want to say Baruch Shem either because it's too long and it's a hefsek. So the Gemara in Sotah concludes that that's how the Mishnah, that's the understanding of the Mishnah, that they wouldn't say amen in the Beit HaMikdash for Birkat Kohanim either, which is fascinating. What do they have against saying the word amen? So, I mean, Ismail Bogan, one of the foremost scholars of liturgy, he believes that they just felt it was inappropriate, but he never explained himself. He died in like the 1943. He never really explained what he meant by inappropriate. It could be just it was a linguistic thing, that the word was too legalistic, too terse. It meant like affirmative, and it just wasn't original, and therefore in the Beit HaMikdash they weren't comfortable with it. That's one theory. The other theory is, and if you go back much earlier, is the theory of the Ravad. The Ravad is brought by the Rashba in Brachot, Daf Samach Gimel Amud Aleph. He says, let me just find it on my page here. I'm sorry. He says he brings the pasuk in Nehemiah, and it's not on my screen. I'm sorry, but in Nehemiah in Perek Ches pasuk Vav, it says that Nehemiah was made the bracha ala Torah, right? He vayvarach es ha'am v'amru amen, and then he begins to read from the Sefer Torah. So clearly, Ezra was coming after the inauguration of Bayis Sheni, right? He's in the temple. He's on the Temple Mount. He's saying a bracha. Everyone answers amen for Birchas HaTorah, and then he begins to read Birchas HaTorah. So the Rashba, in the name of the Rav, it says, what's going on? How could you say amen in the Beit HaMikdash? It must be that Ezra held you could say amen in the Beit HaMikdash. The only time we don't say amen in the Beit HaMikdash is for special Shmona Esreis, like the Amidah, or some say the Amidah, specifically the Amidah of Ta'anit Tzibor. Fascinating idea. So according to the Ravad, that would mean that no, they did say Amen in the Beit HaMikdash. They just had a specific thing about Shmona Esrei, and by Shmona Esrei they would say Baruch Shem, but that doesn't compensate for Berchs Kehanim. So we're stuck here with a very confusing history about what exactly happened in the Beit HaMikdash and the mystery of why in the world they didn't like it. One thing we know for sure, however, is that Bigvulin, in the outlying areas outside of the Beit HaMikdash and outside of the Shar HaMizrah, of the eastern gate of Yerushalayim, they were beginning to develop this minhag to say, I didn't bring that specific Gemara, but the Gemara Sotah says that there were two Tanaim which followed the minhag of the Beit HaMikdash. Outside of the Beit HaMikdash, everybody started liking Amen better than Baruch Shem Kvod Malchut Olam Va'ed, and they used Amen instead of Baruch Shem. But in the Beit HaMikdash, they said Baruch Shem. The Gemara says there were two Tanaim, and this is also a Tosefta. It was Rabbi Chalafta and Rabbi Hanani ben Trajan, that in the towns of Sipori and the towns of Sichni, they preferred to use Baruch Shem Kvod Malchut Olam Va'ed instead of Amen. And the Chachamim disagreed with them, and they said no, change to Amen. So we see that after the Churban, in the early 100s, there was a period of evolution here. There were some communities that were saying Baruch Shem, some communities that were saying Amen, and somehow, probably for the ease of use, Amen won out, probably because it's just one word. It's easy to pronounce. Doesn't matter where you're from. It's a Semitic word. It's not just in Hebrew. It's also in Syriac. It's also in Aramaic. There's many other Semitic languages which have the same word, including Arabic. So it was probably the easiest option, and this is what spread. Most famously, there's a Gemara in Sukkah, Daf Nun Aleph Amud Bet, which says the famous story of the Great Synagogue of Alexandria. The Great Synagogue of Alexandria was called Diopli di Stiva. It was the Duopli, I forgot how to say this in Greek, but Duopolstoa, I think, is how you say it in Greek. Something to that effect. It means like the synagogue of the two great stoas, the two great column structures. Essentially, the Gemara says as follows, and I'll just read it from here. There's two or three similar Mamari Chazal like this. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Misha lo ra'a Diopliston shel Alexandria shel Mitzrayim lo ra'a b'chodan shel Yisrael. Whoever did not see the great synagogue of Egypt, of Alexandria, never saw the glory of the Jewish people. Amru, they used to say, Kamin Basilike Gedola Haita. It was like these great basilica with a colonnade within a colonnade. It had Sitav Lefanav Mistav. It had a stoa within a stoa. Sometimes it would have twice 600,000, 1.2 million people inside the synagogue, which is probably an exaggeration of some sort. והיו בה 71 קתדראות של זהב, כנגד 71 של סנהדרי גדולה. They had 70, I think, not cathedrals. I don't know exactly what that word is. Pillars of gold or promenades of gold. Keneged the 71 Sanhedrin people in the Sanhedrin. Wow, each one weighed 21 kikar zav. Ubima shel eitz b'amsiyata, and they had a wooden altar in the middle. V'hachazan cheneset omed alev v'sudran biyado. And this is the important part. The shliach tzibor would stand in the middle, and he would have a flag in his hand, a banner. The kivan shegiu la'anot amen. And when the shliach tzibor would come to say the when it was time to answer amen, he would wait. Halah menif b'suda v'chol anam onim amen. Somebody who was designated, whether it was the chazan or the shliach tzibor, he would wave the flag and everybody would answer amen. The place was so big, you couldn't hear that the chazan finished the bracha to answer amen. So someone had to wave a flag so that everybody could answer amen. And I'm showing here on my screen an image of the great, what is this called? This synagogue. It's the shul of Eliyahu Hanavi in Cairo, and not in Cairo, somewhere in Egypt, maybe in Alexandria, I don't remember where, but they rebuilt a massive shul in Egypt that was from the 1300s, and they restored it and rebuilt it to look, very much the same way. It has two columns of basilica inside the shul to mimic that ginormous idea from the old shuls from that time. So the Gemara says who destroyed it? It was Alexander the Great. The Gemara in Yerushalmi says it was Emperor Trajan, which would be almost 200 something years later, that destroyed this great synagogue. But it's possible that it was, destroyed and rebuilt. Regardless, we see that the Amen outside of Eretz Yisrael and outside of Yerushalayim especially was an integral part of the liturgy even before the Churban, because whether it was Alexander the Great, whether it was Emperor Trajan, both of them lived before the turn, before the year zero, before the year one. Therefore, we must conclude that Amen was an integral part of the liturgy even before the fall of the second Beis Hamikdash. Beautiful. That's where we're holding historically. The next thing we find, let's move on past the time of the Beis Hamikdash. The next thing we find is how it becomes a part not just of the liturgy, but also part of the halacha. And we find that in the Mishnayot, especially in the Mishnah and Brachot, let me just admit somebody, sorry. We find how, especially in the Mishnayot and Brachot, Amen becomes a halachic construct. It becomes required to answer Amen after a bracha. It becomes required to say Amen after each one of the three parts of the Birkat Kohanim. Amen is just, what's it called? Integral to being Yotzei. If you want to be Yotzei, if somebody says a bracha and you want him to be Motzi you have to answer Amen. And if you don't, then you're not Yotzei. We have an Amen Yetoma, an Amen Chatufa. You have Amens that are cut off, Amens that are orphaned or too far away from the bracha. And there's a whole halachic construct around Amen. And even more so, the Tanoim and Amoraim teach us that saying Amen has an enormous power. So let's take one example from the Gemara in Brachot, Daf Nun Gimel Amud Bet. It says, "Lememer devar chadif mimad danei Amen, v'atani b'yosi omer gadol ha'one Amen yoter min ha'mavrech." The Gemara tells us something incredible, which is that according to Rabbi Yossi, a person, this is a Tana, a person who answers Amen gets more schar than a person who says the bracha. Amr Leir bin Horai said to him, Hashamayim, I swear by the heaven, ken hu, it is true. Teda, sharei guliaron yodinu mitkarim b'milchama v'gbarim yordinu menatzchin. You should know that in battle, often they send the lesser troops down to the battlefield to initiate the war, and then afterwards they send shock troops. They send the mighty warriors. And what he's saying is that the Amen that follows is like the mightier troops. So you can have one person saying a bracha, but everyone answering Amen is the force which drives the bracha home, and that gives you more schar. Tanaihi, so the Gemara answers at the end, it's machoket tanaim, some hold one is greater, one is not. One of the Tanaim holds that, yes, it's true, not that it's true that you get more schar, but you get schar more quickly if you answer Amen, more than if you are the person who says the bracha. Fascinating teaching of the Tanaim. Ben Azai Omer, Ben Azai says, this is Gemara Brachot Afim Zayin Amud Aleph, Kol ha'one Amen yitoma yu banev yitomim. Chatufa yitchatefu yamav. Kitufa yikatefu yamim. Curses. Basically, he's saying anybody who says an orphaned Amen, his children will be orphaned. He says an abbreviated Amen, his days will be abbreviated. One who recites a truncated Amen, his days will be truncated. And the Gemara goes on to explain the halachic, like what is an Amen Chatufa, what is an Amen Ketufa, etc. Then it says, V'kol ha'ma'arich ba'amen, whoever elongates his answering of the Amen, ma'arichin lo yamav shnotav. A person who says Amen long and strong, he's going to have a long, happy, and healthy life. Furthermore, we see in the Gemara Shabbat of Kufyutet Amud Bet, it says, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Kol ha'one Amen Yehei Shemei Rabba Mevarach. Whoever says Amen and then follows that with Yehei Shemei Rabba Mevarach, blessed be God's name, the great name, B'chol kocho, with all his strength. And Rashi says it doesn't mean with all your strength, like don't be a crazy person. It means with all your kavanah, like don't be a clown. Korin lo gzar dino, we rip up any evil decrees that came upon him. Shene'amar b'fruah piraot b'Yisrael b'nitatev am baruch Hashem. When we annul the decrees of Klal Yisrael b'nitatev am baruch Hashem. My tama, why does the pasuk say b'fruah piraot when we annul the decrees? Mishum de baruch Hashem, because they said baruch Hashem. Amar Rabbi Yochanan goes further. He says, even if a person has a slight sin of being oved avodah zarah, mochalin lo, we forgive his sin. Whoever answers Amen with all his strength, we open for him the gates of Gan Eden. Al tiknei shomer emunim. Don't read the pasuk as shomer emunim. Rather, she'omrim amen. Homiletically, he says, we open the gates for tzaddikim, for those who answer amen properly. My amen, and then another homily, the Gemara says, what does amen stand for? Amar Rabbi Chanina, kel melech ne'eman. This is where we get this idea that amen stands for aleph mem nun, the God, our King, who is faithful. Yes, we affirm, when we say amen, yes, we affirm in our God, our King, who is faithful. Beautiful Gemara. And these are beautiful promises from the Tanaim themselves that saying amen has an extraordinary power, klape mala, in the Shemayim. Okay. I should also mention, just for sake of completion, there's a Gemara Shavuot, which is talking about the amens of a sotah. And the Gemara says that there's three qualities to amen. It says, Amar Yossi Bar Chanina, amen yesh bo shivua, bo kabbalat dvarim, bo hamanat dvarim. Sometimes when you answer amen, it could be a shvua, it could be a kabbalat dvarim, it could be a hamanat dvarim, that not just you accept, but also that you believe. So amen has three, the Gemara is explaining, amen could have three different sorts of meanings. One is, yes, I accept this swear upon me. The other is, yes, I accept that this is true. The next is, yes, I accept to do this. The last one is, yes, I accept that this is true. Okay. So moving on. As we just noted, the Gemara said in Shabbat Kuf Yotet Amud Amru Shem and Levi Kolona and men Yehei Shemei Rabba Mivrach B'chol Kochol Korin Lo Gezar Dino. Right? So it conflates amen with the words Yehei Shemei Rabba Mivrach. So amen and Yehei Shemei Rabba get put together all of a sudden. So let's do a little bit of a recap of what we understood about Kaddish so that we can understand what I'm about to say. When we studied Kaddish, we explained that Kaddish began its life as a messianic doxology. In other words, a unit of praise which praises God and hopes for the redemption. That's what Kaddish began its life as. It began its life as a praise of God that also hopes for the messianic redemption. When would the Jewish people in ancient times say something like this? And the prayer was called a nechemata, right? When would they say a nechemata? They would say it at the end of a sermon, at the end of a lecture, at the end of a study period. They would say a nechemata. We have many records of nechematas. We have all different types. Some of the most famous ones are like Uva L'Tzion, Yikum Purkan, and Kaddish. But those are some of the most famous ones, especially the Kaddish De'atid Le'etchadeta. These are famous Kaddishim. So what we learned in the past was that most of the emphasis of this Yehei Shmei Rabbah was at the end of a study. And when the earliest sources that we have for Kaddish are Gemarot, which only say Amen Yehei Shmei, which only say Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mivrach. When the Gemarot speak about the study period from which you answer Amen Kaddish after, it never calls it Kaddish. The Gemara never has anything that it considers or calls by name Kaddish. It only says Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mivrach L'Olam Omaya. So this begs the question as to what was the birth, the earliest birth of Amen inside the Kaddish. Is Amen native to the Kaddish? And is Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mivarach attached to that Amen? So there was a scholar who lived in Europe before the war, before the Second War. I think he died in 1959, right? So his name was Tzvi Karl. Rabbi Shaya Volgemuth, who has a Sefer on Tefillah, really loves Rabbi Tzvi Karl's Sfarim. He was one of the earlier scholars of Jewish liturgy, and he worked in Ukraine and in Poland, and he published some very famous works like mechkarim, or studies on Tefillah. So he also famously wrote less famously, besides his famous book on Tefillah, he also wrote a work on Kaddish. Now, he's an incredible scholar because just his breadth of knowledge, and he was religious, if anybody's interested, but his breadth of knowledge was incredible. He knew every single Mamar Chazal to his fingertips. And his flaw really comes from his historical methodology. His methodology is ragged. It's just all over the place. Very difficult to accept his methodology from a historical perspective. But he has some very important theories very often his theories are sound, even if his evidence is completely unreliable. Regardless, Tzvi Karl wrote a sefer on a study of tefillah, but he also wrote a sefer on the study of Kaddish. And this sefer that he wrote on Kaddish is based on an article he wrote in a journal called Hashiloach, which was published before World War I, right? So he published it in this journal, and then the war happened, and the world was destroyed, to put it simply. Europe was destroyed, and very few people, if any, had ever seen his article on Kaddish. He was kind of miffed by it, and he decided, I'm going to republish it, but not as an article. I'm going to expand it and publish it as a book. And he wrote in the introduction to this book that I'm going to publish this book because nobody has a copy of it, and I want everybody to have a copy. The joke is on him because he published this in 1935, and then World War II broke out, and then the world was destroyed all over again. And today, there's no more than 5 libraries on the planet that have a copy of this book, the Kaddish, a physical copy of this book that he wrote on Kaddish. There's like 5 libraries in the entire world. If you're a serious scholar of liturgy, you'll find it, but you're not going to find it easily. It's a very hard sefer to find. So I was privileged to go to the microfilm department in the New York Public Library. They happen to have it in microfilm. So I did the world a favor. I went to the computers. I digitized it. I found the entire sefer. I digitized it and I put it on archive.org because for the next guy, whoever's following my footsteps here, if you want to read his sefer on Kaddish, it's there. Regardless, what Tzvi Karl does in this sefer is fascinating, and he has a lot of very interesting theories about how the Kaddish developed. Most of them are questionable at best. A lot of the material he brings is essential. A lot of the material he brings is absolutely essential. And he saw the earlier work of Rabbi David Isola Pula in 1909, which influenced him greatly. However, his own theories are kind of questionable. But what I want to bring back to here is his theory about Amen. His theory about Amen is very important because he sees the Amen and the Kaddish as clues to the late addition of the Amens to the Kaddish. He believes that Kaddish was 2 different tefillot that were later joined. The part about Yitkada v'Kadash me'arba be'alma di barachute right? Ba'agala b'zman kariv, all the way until Ba'agala b'zman kariv was prayer number 1. Yehei Shemei Rabba Mivrach La'olam Me'amaya was prayer number 2. And later these prayers were joined. And people would answer Amen Tiyat Gadal, and they would answer, then they would continue with responding to Amen Yehei Shemei Rabba Mivrach. That part is a very interesting, very important theory, because we have other tefillot which start like Ala Kol Yit Gadal V'Yit Kadash, which we say after the Haftarah. So he believes that the Yit Gadal V'Yit Kadash is just one of the versions of the Al HaKol, Yit Gadal Nechamata, which is a Nechamata. So you had one Nechamata, which is Yitkadav Yitkadash. You had another Nechamata, which is a response, Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivrach. And he believes that those 2 were joined later. He even believes, and this part I cannot accept, he believes that Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivrach was recited in the Beis HaMikdash. The proof for that is a little bit weak, but he believes that Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivrach is effectively Baruch es Hashem Amvarech Le'olam Va'ed, or as it says in Yoav, Hashem Natan v'Hashem Lakach, Yishem Hashem Mevorach. So he believes that because Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivrach La'olam Me'amaya is essentially the same thing as those Pesukim, it's the same thing as Baruch Shem Kvod Malchus L'olam Va'ed, or the same thing as Yishem Hashem Mevorach. Therefore, it's basically a parallel to what they used in the temple, and it's just a classic response prayer of educated Jews. So he believes they were joined later. Regardless, he sees the amens in the Kaddish as a clue as to the development of the Kaddish. And he puts each amen and he studies each amen. Does it say, let's say he studies the Seder of Amram Gon, and he finds the earliest Kaddishes that we have in manuscript. And he says, well, look where it says amen here. Look where it says v'imru amen here. It says amen here and it says v'imru. So here they had to say, and tell everybody it says amen. And then tell everybody to say amen. Why would you say that unless nobody knew to answer amen? Because it was a new innovation. And he has all sorts of theories about that. It's kind of cool, kind of interesting. I don't know if I can accept all of it, but these are important theories to review, and I just thought they were very much worth mentioning. So, oops, okay. Sorry, I accidentally stopped the screen share. Give me a second. There we go. Okay, so that's so much for Tzvi Karl. Now, one of the interesting things about those early amens is that in the Seder of Amram Gaon, and indeed this was one of the earliest minhagim of amen, the minhag was to say, Yitbarach, amen. They would put an amen after the word Yitbarach. Why would they do this? So the Rishonim have this very interesting midrash. The midrash says that there was a Amora or a Tana who was walking on the way. In other words, he was doing a meditation, and he meets a man carrying 4,000 camels with fire and wrath on the back of the camels, whatever that means, some sort of allegory. And he asks the man or the angel, what are all these four camels? What are these 4,000 camels for? In some of the versions, it's like Eliyahu Navi. Now, Eliyahu Navi tells him, these 4,000 camels are for whoever interrupts between Yehei Abba Mevarach and Yisbarach. So nobody could interrupt between those two sections of Kaddish. It sounds like Yisbarach, Vishtabach, Vispar was added later from this early medrash. That's what it sounds like. The whole Yisbarach section was added later. Regardless, what it also sounds like is that, at least a simple reading, is that you cannot make a hefsek between those two words. So when do you answer amen? You don't say amen Yisbarach. You must say amen after Yisbarach. So this is where that early minute comes from, to put an amen after Yisbarach, because of this simplistic reading of that midrash. Now, others have learned, no, it just means don't talk in the middle of Kaddish, right? That's all it means. It doesn't mean something complicated like, it doesn't mean something complicated. It doesn't mean something complicated like that you have to put an amen after Yitbarach, and eventually over the generations that minhag evaporated. One more midrash I wanted to show you, and I'm sorry that I skipped it over in the screen share. This is a midrash in Sifrei, in Shin Vav, in Sifrei Dvarim. It says Kishem Hashem Ekra. The one of the Tanaim, Rabbi Yossi, learns out the obligation to say amen from a pasuk, right? And he says something fascinating. He says, Minayin, how do you know that those who stand in the Beit HaKnesset and say Baruch Hu Hashem Baruch, you have to answer Baruch Hashem Baruch L'Olam Ved? Because the pasuk says, Kishem Hashem Ekra Habu Godel L'Olokenu. Okay, this is classic. But then he says, Uminayin Sha'onin Amen Achar Mavarech. How do you know that you have to say Amen after a bracha? Shene Amar, it says Habu Godel L'Olokenu. Uminayin Shamru Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto L'Olam Ved. Hold up. V'nemar. Did I not cut out the part I wanted to? Yeah, sorry. The last part is what I wanted. How do you know you say Yehei Shemo Hagadol Mavarach Shonim Achrem La'alam Lomei Olamim Shenemar Havu Godel Le'Elokenu? How do you know that if a person says Yehei Shemo Hagadol Mavarach, that people have to answer La'olam Lomei Olamim, as it says Havu Godel Le'Elokenu? So over here in this medrash, we see in Hebrew they were saying some form of Kaddish after a study in Hebrew, some sort of earlier version of Kaddish in Hebrew, and Le'olam U'Le'olmei Olamim was a response to Yehei Shemo Hagadol Mevarach. So what my point is, Tzvi Karl is onto something. Clearly, from the earliest sources in Chazal, we see that Kaddish, the earliest forms of this messianic doxology, was made up of multiple components, and the way that they recited Kaddish in the olden times might have had amens in places that we don't expect. That's my point. My point is not to do an exhaustive review of every one of Tzvi Karl's rayas and otherwise, because it's complicated and fun, also crazy. Not crazy, but like what? Creative, I guess. It's crazy difficult, I would say, to follow his very interesting creative way of going through his different proofs. And again, it's astonishingly important to go through Tzvi Karl's Sefer on Kaddish. You're welcome. If you need to find it, it's on archive.org. Just search Tzvi Karl Kaddish. You'll find it. I also put it on Wikipedia on the page for anybody who needs it. And hopefully anybody who's following in my footsteps here could also follow that Sefer. The last thing I wanted to mention about the history of Amen is how, of course, in the history of halacha, amen becomes essential to the halachic structure. As I mentioned already in the time of the Mishnah, you have the Mishnah giving halachic weight to amen, that you have to answer your brachas with amen. Now, and you have to be Yosef, you have to put amen. You can't get it cut off, etc., etc. A lot of halachas revolve around amen. But one of the most interesting ones that I ever found is a story with Rabbeinu Tam. It's a Russian chulin, Parak Vav Halacha Ches. The Gemara over there has this halacha where if somebody steals, I think it's the mitzvah of Kisoy Hadam, there's a knas of Asar Zehuvim. There's a knas, you have to pay 10 gold coins. And he says a story that there was a mohel who came late to a bris milah, and somebody else did the bris milah instead. And he's like, you stole my mitzvah. I want a knas of 10 gold coins. So Rabbeinu Tam told him, first of all, no. There's Gemara Bakama, he brings halachic raya, Malchim Shem by Chesar and Kiss. There's no Chesar and Kiss, we're not going to do a knas. And second of all, he says, the Gemara says, Gadol ha'ayne amein yoser min ha'mavarich. You heard the bracha from the mohel. You could have answered amen, and therefore you would have had more schar than the mohel. So you can't claim, oh, you stole my mitzvah, and I'm going to get the asar zehuvim. No, you're the one who got a bigger mitzvah. And if you didn't answer amen, well, that's your problem. So we can see that the Rabbeinu Tam used this halacha of Rabbi Yossi, that Gadol ha'ayne amein yoser min ha'mavarich. He used it legally. He used it literally. And if a person answers amen, halachically speaking, he gets more schar because he's driving home the bracha and he's bringing it to its full mass, its full completion, its full strength. And it's honestly true. When we use the response congregationally, everybody understands how the response makes the prayer itself more powerful. And it's no surprise that a word so simple and a word so universal became a staple of not just Jewish liturgy, but of course other liturgies as well. And with that, I think we'll end our study tonight of Kaddish and the Amen. And Bli Neder next week, we will start with the early history of Pesukei Zimra. So thank you everybody for your time and attention. And I will pause the recording now.